welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jen, and I am joined by a writer and the editor of a fantastic volume of horror short stories that I am so excited to talk about. Welcome to the show. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Tom Deady, and I write horror fiction. My first novel, Haven, won the Bram Stoker Award back in 2017. And I've since put out a bunch of novels, novellas, short story collection. I have a YA horror novel out there. And then I decided to try something different and try my hand at editing an anthology, and The Rack is the result of that. It's my love letter to the days I grew up reading horror when every store had a spinner rack in it, whether it was a drugstore, a gas station, a grocery store, and you could just look at all these crazy, lurid horror covers of the mass market paperbacks and just get lost in those titles. And so I asked 20 of the hottest writers out there now to try and emulate those books, the Grady Hendrix paperbacks from hell, if you will. And man, they all came through just with amazing stories, and Lynn Hansen's cover is absolutely perfect. And here we are.
Uh, it is so good. Yeah, and that cover really does like perfectly evoke just like the vibe of the book
Yes,
and the stories that we are talking about. It is so effective. And gosh, it really does just like combine so many brilliant writers right now, all the heavy hitters.
yes.
Yeah, really impressive. So, what goes into bringing a book like this to life? You know, you explained that you've reached out to all these writers. What goes into editing the collection then? Like, do you edit on a story level? Do you do a lot of work determining like the order they should be presented in? What goes into like shaping the book itself?
Yeah, that was a big learning curve for me. So I did the editing story by story as I got them in. And honestly, with the caliber of writers in there, that job was painfully easy because every story came in clean and, very little work for me to do on the editing side. What I did struggle with quite a bit, as you mentioned, was the order because I started reading articles about the mixture of science and magic it is to get the perfect order for stories, whether it's by tone, by length, but there's all these different kind of formulas people use. And again, this is my first time doing it, so I just crossed my fingers and hope for the best. I tried to follow as much advice as I could. The one thing that really made this so easy for me was I ended up with a story called Black Pages and a story called White Pages, which were just the perfect bookends to the entire collection.
That is, oh gosh, that is such a nice little confluence. It really does work beautifully to bookend, yeah, all of the stories. And it does, like every story obviously tells a story of its own, but then, yeah, a collection is sort of like an operatic movement almost, you know, with like its own sort of, yeah, journey of tones and
Right.
tensions.
Yeah, we did have a lot of different tones. I mean, again, we were trying to mimic an entire almost generation of work. So that's why there's such a um what do I want to say? There's such a diversity of stories with you've got Jeff Strand with his almost comedy horror with the Slipper story, and then you've got Mercedes Yardley with one of the most beautiful literary horror works I've ever read, and pretty much everything in between. You've got the creepy dolls, the giant insects. Laurel Hightower kind of modernized it to the horrors we live in today with a school shooting story. It's literally something for everyone. And again, I owe all the credit to the authors for this.
Yeah, so my personal the rack growing up was actually like a big bin at our local CVS full of like, you know, paperbacks that cost a dollar or two.
Okay.
And it really was like my entry into horror. I read like tons of like Amityville spin-offs and you know, lots of like really pulpy 70s stuff, but like really good and really scary stuff. What was your personal rack, that sort of was your entry point into the genre and the vibe?
Sure, I talk about it in the afterword to the anthology. I remember being probably 12 or 13. I needed something to read. I had kind of grown out of my Hardy Boys, Alfred Hitchcock and the Three Investigators books, and I was looking for, something. We didn't really have YA back then. It was either kind of kids books like the Hardy Boys stuff or adult stuff. So I rode my bike down to the local Woolworth. I don't know if you guys remember Woolworths. It was kind of a mini department store back in the day, and they had a couple of spinner racks in the front of the store, and I was just having a blast looking through it, and I came across this, and I know the listeners can't see it, but it's the original Salem's Lot paperback with the all black cover with just the drop of red blood. I had never heard of Stephen King because it was his second book, I think. And I just went home and devoured it, and that was it. I was hooked for life.
That is such a good book. And it's funny, my husband is actually rereading that one right now. And what an entryway into like into horror.
It's really it doesn't hold up perfectly, but it hold thematically it does with the vibe and the small town and there's a lot of things that happened back in the 70s that aren't accepted today that show up in the book, but you just have to take that with a grain of salt because that is really the way it was back then. So
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, every like work of fiction also eventually becomes like a historical artifact, that's
it
sort of
does, it
hot on the
does.
time.
Yeah, one of the other kind of famous paperback from hell covers was Audrey Rose. I don't know if you remember that. It was a reincarnation story. And I went back and revisited that a couple of years ago because one of my favorite audio narrators, Matt Godfrey, actually did an updated audio version of it. And I listened to that and I was just cracking up. Like the people are like smoking in the hospitals, and the guy goes home from work and puts on his smoking jacket and his ascot to relax. And I'm just like, wow. It's like a
That's
time machine.
it is. Yeah, and that is actually I found that book in the bin like at CVS. That was that's so
It's a great story, but just some of the background stuff is just so bizarre. The husband gets home from work and expects the wife to have a drink ready for him, and it's just like, no, that's not how it is.
the covers are such a big part of it, because
Yes.
sort of like what drew your eye as you were passing by in the drugstore or, wherever you were. So what was the process of like working on the cover for this book with Lynn Hansen? I've like interviewed so many people now who have covers from Lynn. And
Lynn is, yeah,
oh,
she's one of the top ones out there right now for sure. Again, it was pretty easy. We talked about kind of the vibe of the stories and all that, and she read them all. And she was kind of like, okay, do you have any ideas? And my idea was the rack, just like a spinny rack and I didn't have the idea for the skeleton, but yeah, she came up with, I know people can't see it, but the great cover. And it was all, my idea was just like, I just want a rack on it because that's the visual I want. And she came up with the skeleton, and she actually came up with the mini book covers for each of the store, or not each, but some of the stories that are in there to be on the actual rack, which was just, it's so meta and it was mind blowing. And I love it so much.
it is, it's so good. And as we've been talking and saying the rack so much, it just occurred to me that, like the rack is also like a torture device, and
Yes.
it really captures like the allure of horrors. Like this is really scary and it's going to be unpleasant in some ways, but also like it's thrilling and it's like it hooks you in and like you love it.
Yeah, I can't speak highly enough of the stories I received for this because they were all just home runs in my eyes, and I hope the readers feel the same way.
Absolutely. Can you talk a little bit about working with Will Erickson on the intro? Because the intro is also really beautiful. And I think it's there that he says that the short story is the best showcase for horror fiction. And I'm wondering, do you also agree with that? Because I do, I think, but I don't know why.
I'm kind of on the opposite end of that spectrum because, and I did grow up reading a lot of short stories, but I also grew up reading books like It and Summer of Night and Boy's Life and all Robert McCammon, Stephen King, and there are all these giant doorstops with huge cast of characters and sweeping subplots that, they and that's what drew me in. I just love the world building and I love knowing everything about the characters and everything about what's happening other than the main horror plot going on. And that's the one thing that you don't get in the short story. The short story is like a punch to the gut, and it's a great media, but for me, my love is always going to be big, giant, fat novels.
That's a great point too, and I think like when I was becoming a horror fan, I really used the short stories as like my discovery tool for
Right.
the people who were writing the novels because I was just as big a fan of like The Stand, which was absolutely the longest book that I had read like at that point
Yes.
in my life. So
Yeah, and to get back to Will Erickson, I had originally approached Grady Hendrix because I wanted to. My original idea was to call it like Anthology from Hell and almost tie it into the paperbacks from Hell. And unfortunately, Grady is just way too busy being Grady Hendrix because he's everywhere. And somebody suggested, and I didn't even realize that Will Erickson had co-wrote and done a lot of the research for Paperbacks from Hell, and I think it might have been Lynn who actually suggested that. And I reached out to him, and yeah, he wrote a beautiful, beautiful introduction to the book.
it's great. And yeah, Grady Hendrix is like he's like a missionary for horror, you know.
If you ever get a chance to see him do one of his live performances, and it is a performance, he doesn't go up and read, he doesn't go up and just kind of blather on about horror. He has slideshows with all the covers and he has songs and he sings and it is the most out of control thing you'll ever see and it's beautiful.
I have to see that. Yeah, he does mystery screenings at the Nighthawk in Brooklyn, and I'm dying to make it to one of those
Oh,
too.
you've got to see him live. He's so good.
Oh. So, what is it that you think made the period of time that we're talking about, the sort of 70s, 80s, the golden age of horror? Because I think it was happening not only in writing, but on the screen too, because you have like peak era, like practical effects, like leading into the era of like The Thing and all of like really, really great horror movies. What do you think was sort of going on that made it such a rich time?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question because a lot of great horror comes from things that are happening in the world, and horror can be very escapist for people to write and read. But yeah, it is true. Like the 70s were not that bad a time in America in terms of, world crises. There was no real, I mean, Vietnam was pretty much over. And I don't know, I feel like it was just a next step from I don't want to say maturation because all the older stuff is great, but I feel like it was a next step to say, okay, we've done all the gothic and the hauntings and we've done alien invasions and of course everything is a metaphor for something else. Every giant bug movie back then was really we're afraid of radiation. Every alien invasion was we're afraid of Russia. So horror has always been kind of a metaphor for those things, and I really think it was we were kind of in a lull, and people just decided to branch out with the creativity and see what else they could do with the genre. And that's my total off the cuff speculation. I really have no idea, but you nailed it. It was the heyday for horror. You couldn't go in to any bookstore and not have a giant horror section. Like the spinner racks were everywhere, and they were all horror novels. And we saw that go away in the 90s, and I have my own opinions on that. I really feel like it was the almost horror exploitation movies of the 90s, like the Hostels and like the really over the top gore for the sake of gore that everybody saw every day on their TVs, trailers for these movies and said, "Oh, that's what horror is. I don't want to do that." And we actually hit in horror writing quite a period of time in the late 90s and even early 2000s where you go back and look at those books, you won't find the word horror. It'll say supernatural thriller or paranormal something, or like they just shied away from the word itself. And again, my opinion only, but I think it had a lot to do with those like over the top movies that people just didn't care for.
Mm, that's a really good point. And it kind of gives really good context for like where we are with horror right now, which is like we're in another really good time for
We
horror,
are.
think. And you are getting like stuff that is campy or kind of funny, like you did in the earlier periods, but also like we have the sort of the phenomenon of like quote unquote elevated horror right
Yes.
now. And a lot of these stories really dance on that line, like in a really gorgeous way. Like they are campy and just like embracing like the love of the genre in like a really
Yes.
earnest way, but also like saying very serious things about like the world that we're living in. Yeah.
I totally agree. I think we've kind of gone back and updated everything that was being done back in the 70s and 80s and kind of laid them over the events that are happening today to bring, instead of bringing forth fear of nuclear war or things like that. Now it's, fear of homophobia and transphobia and racism, and well, I guess that one never went away, but yeah, I think today's writers are doing a beautiful job of walking that line between entertainment and social justice and social issues. It's really something amazing to see.
Mm. So I saw on your website that you currently have submissions open for the Rack 2, which
I
is very
do.
exciting. So yeah, could you talk about what your plans are for that one? Are you going into it with the same sort of mindset and perspective, or are you planning anything different this time, or?
Nothing different other than the writers. What I want to do is not so the first rack was invite only. I invited those 20 people. They all submitted great stories. This one, I'm inviting 15 to 16 different authors, and I'm going to leave a handful of stories open for submissions just to get, I don't know, kind of a sense of new voices out there too that other people may not have heard of. But other than that, thematically, I want it to be basically a continuation of what I've done with the rack, and I've already got a pretty stellar lineup for for part two. This really is like lightning in a bottle, and I just wanted to capture that and try to keep it going. So I've got I'm not going to name any names, but I've got some really, really big names, both from today's horror market and big names from what you would have seen on the rack back in the day.
That is so exciting. Well, don't be surprised if I, get in touch again to talk about that one when it is
Oh,
coming
I
in.
would love to. I would do these shows every day to talk about not my stuff, but just horror in general. I just it's been my life since I picked up Salem's Lot. So
Yes, yeah, I love that there's like just this really beautiful horror community that is also,
yes.
come up around these things. And yeah, seriously, you're welcome back anytime. And thank you so much for coming by and sharing your book with me.
Oh, this was great. Thank you for having me. I'm happy to come back anytime.
Right. Okay, listeners, it's now up to you. Please check out The Rack. It is so, so good. By the time that you hear it, it will be out in the world. So head to your favorite independent bookstore or library or, CVS, like if you can still find it there, maybe. We'll see. Well, maybe my local CVS, I'll get it in there. All right. Thank you for joining us. It is now time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.